All right, hello everyone. It's 11 o'clock, so we can go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us today for Adobe Creative Cloud Design Basics. We're going to talk a little bit about what we're going to cover, but first, some introductions. My name is Susie Johannes, and I am a technology instructor. With me, we have Tennille Fincham. She's also a technology instructor, and she's helping to monitor the our Skype for Business online meeting. So hopefully you should be hearing audio at this point. If you're not, I'm hoping that everyone's going to send us a chat message to say that they can't hear us. Maybe I'll point out that you should be hearing audio at this point. So both Tennille and I, we have a lot of experience using Adobe InDesign for different design projects. Tennille has an advertising degree and used it quite a bit, both in her academic and professional life. Me as well, I have a design degree and worked as a graphic designer for a long time before starting as a technology instructor. So we've both had a lot of experience, and hopefully we'll be sharing some little nuggets with you as we go. So a little bit about this course and the format. This is one of our Quick Learn series. Um, what this is we're doing these every 2 weeks via Skype for Business, and these are topic-based presentations that we're holding around the lunch hour. So I'll send out a follow-up with the remaining sessions that are in this series that you can sign up for. And if you have any ideas for topics we should cover, feel free to email us and we can work that in to either our summer or fall schedule. Today, Tennille is here to help facilitate questions. We'll stop often and we'll ask that you post your questions through the chat window. So feel free to do that at any time, but we will post or actually stop for questions. You may have noticed that we started a recording. We are recording this session so that we can post it on our website for anyone who couldn't attend. Or if you want to reference it at a later date, you'll be able to do that as well. So I'll send out as a follow-up some links, and one of the links will be the link to the recording. Just a few things before we talk about the course. If you haven't been in a Skype for Business meeting, welcome to the whole world of Skype for Business online meetings. A few things that could help your experience. One, you might want to maximize your window by, clicking on that maximize button in the upper right-hand corner. Two, I believe everyone's muted, and that sounds great. If you were to want to ask a question, that's a good time to unmute yourself. But if you're just following along, it's great to stay muted. When you're muted, you will see a slash through your microphone. Finally, that chat message, you can toggle that on and off. So if you want to see the messages that are coming in or type a message, you can click on that small message icon in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. And then if you want to have more of your screen for the presentation, you can turn that on and off. So the overview of today, we're going to talk a little bit about what is Adobe Creative Cloud. We're going to talk about how you can get Adobe Creative Cloud if you don't already have it. And we'll look at a sample workflow for a print project. That'll help kind of introduce us to the big three. So the big three we're talking about today are Adobe Illustrator. When we talk about Adobe Illustrator, I'll demonstrate and show you some files. We'll talk about this key difference between raster versus vector graphics. We'll talk about a difference between colors, so working with RGB graphics versus CMYK, and then within CMYK, process versus spot colors. So as we go, I'll talk about, what tool to use when, and I'll talk about as we're doing that, these design concepts. So these concepts here, raster versus vector, RGB versus CMYK, they're not specific to Illustrator, but we'll cover them in that area. We'll look at Photoshop, we'll look at some sample files, we'll do a little tour, and we'll talk about this idea called resolution and how that kind of plays out in your design projects. And finally, we'll look at InDesign. I'll pull open a sample brochure file. We'll kind of talk about some of the inherent features and functionality of InDesign, and we'll look at different file types. And then we'll have questions throughout, breaks for questions, but we'll have a final wrap up with questions at the end. So like I mentioned, hopefully we'll share a lot of nuggets of information about just regular the world of design, designing for digital or designing for print. And if you have things you want to add, especially, feel free to add those as we go. So first things first, what is Adobe Creative Cloud? Creative Cloud is Adobe's suite of design software. So it used to be that you would purchase disks with software, and that would be called the Creative Suite, and it would have a version like 5 or I don't know if there was a 6. I can't remember, but there's definitely like a 3 and a 4 and a 5. Now how they're distributing the software is via the internet, and so what you do is you basically download and install Creative Cloud, and then from there you can select the individual software programs that you want to download and install on your machine. So the Creative Cloud usually includes all software, but that also includes some of their most popular, which is Photoshop, Illustrator, and InDesign. What's a little bit different about this distribution model is that, before they'd make one big update and that would be a new suite. Now they're making updates throughout the year. So even if you have InDesign on your machine, if you have Photoshop, Illustrator, throughout the year you're going to want to make sure that you update that because, for example, in 2015 there were 2 major updates. And with those updates they're introducing new tools, new functionality, that type of thing. So usually with Creative Cloud, this new distribution model, you usually pay for a monthly subscription. But then, how we get this at KU is a little bit different. So if you are a faculty or staff member on your work machine, you can talk to your tech staff to get Adobe Creative Cloud. Most likely they'll ask you what specific programs that you want, and then they'll be able to push those out to your workstation. I would recommend, if you like what you saw today, Adobe Illustrator, InDesign, and Photoshop. Those are kind of the standbys for any design work. But there are other programs out there, After Effects. We'll look at all the programs in a minute. So that's what you can do for your work machine. 50% of our work machines can get it, so most likely you can get it on your work machine. At home, again, if you're faculty or staff, we have a really great license with Adobe where you can purchase a 1-year subscription for $10 through KU Software Web Store, kansasonthehub.com, kansas.onthehub.com, and I'll make sure you have that in the follow-up notes in case you haven't done so already. That's a huge savings. Normally, especially if you're a staff member, you would have to pay $60 per month for just a regular subscription, so you're saving, like $700 a year by using KU subscription, and you can download and install that on 2 machines. For students, we don't have discounted licensing through KU. However, Adobe does offer discounted monthly licenses just through adobe.com. I believe it's right now around $20 a month. So the students can also download a 30-day trial license if they want to try that out. So we're going to be talking about the big 3 today. This is a little bit of an outdated graphic, but like I mentioned, there are a lot of different software included in the whole Creative Cloud. So Dreamweaver you might be familiar with, After Effects you might be familiar with, Flash. I gotta be honest, I don't know what all of these different software do. The important thing, we're going to be focusing on Photoshop, InDesign, and Illustrator today. So when looking at that, Illustrator, what do you use to do that? What do you use for Illustrator? Most of the time we're talking about logos or icons. People will create branding systems. In Photoshop, we're usually talking about photo editing, modification, manipulation. We'll go into a lot more detail throughout this presentation on these projects. But with InDesign, what we're really talking about is multiple page layouts or single page layouts if you're just doing a flyer. InDesign really has the best kind of tools to work with type and paragraphs, and also the ability to create master pages where those elements will show up on all of your pages. Illustrator doesn't really have the same kind of capabilities, nor does Photoshop for that. As part of the follow-up, I will send you a cheat sheet. We have a PDF, and it has kind of what to use when, and it has just like to help you understand, what the best software will be for your project. So real quickly, I want to do a poll just to see where everyone is at. So let me get that up. All right, so this poll, have you used Adobe Design software in the past? I gave you some examples there. So there's some options here. You can vote on an option by clicking on the radio button beside the option that you want. Cool. So then let me close this poll and I'll show you the results. So it looks like most people are used to one or two of the programs, but maybe haven't used all three. A few people have used all three, so this might be a little bit of review to you. And then a couple people are new to the whole Adobe Creative Cloud design world, so that's great too. Let me make sure I got. Oh, okay. If you're not able to see the poll, it might be because you're using a Mac. Okay, cool. So sorry about that. I should have remembered that. Polling doesn't work on Mac yet. So thanks for the reminder about that. Um, cool. So let me switch back to the desktop and we'll look at this presentation. Oh, okay. If you are able to see it on your Mac, it might be because you're joining through the web app instead of like the desktop software. It's not a big deal. The poll won't be like, isn't that important? All right, so I wanted to run through an example workflow of how this all works. Sometimes people will say, which software is the best one to use, or which software should I start off with? I mean, it's kind of a personal preference, but I will say when you're working on a project like a brochure or a flyer or a report or a book, the answer is you should be using all three. So to kind of give you an idea of what that looks like, this is a sample flyer. And so how this would come together is most likely a designer would have created a logo for the company when the company was started, and they would have done so in Illustrator. Illustrator really has the best tools for creating kind of complex shapes or manipulating type in order to create logos or icons or those kind of branded elements. Then, a photographer probably would have come along, shot some photographs of the office. They might have used Photoshop then to edit those images, maybe brighten them, maybe remove a water bottle or a stuffed animal that was on the desk, those types of things. And then finally, to make the flyer, a designer would have used InDesign to actually bring all of these elements into the page layout. So the designer would have created frames and then done what's called placing, placed the element of the picture, placed the element of the logo, maybe copied and pasted or just typed the text directly into the document. And then finally, we don't really cover this today, but they might have exported the design as a PDF so that whoever needed to review could review and or print that file. So it's very common to, save your layout as a PDF so that anyone can look at it or review it. So I want to pause for questions there. Any questions about that, example workflow or possibly Adobe Creative Cloud? The software that what we've covered so far. Cool. Well, no questions so far. We will keep moving and we'll have more opportunities for questions. So we are going to look first at Illustrator. So what is Illustrator? It's a vector-based software best used for manipulating type or shapes. So like I mentioned, great for logos, great for icons. Here I have great for projects with one or more formats that will change in size. So the reason for that, projects that will change in size, the reason why Illustrator is a good program for that is because it is a vector-based software. So when we're looking at vector-based versus the opposite is raster-based, what we're looking at is how those images are created. So in the image on the right, that letter A is created in Illustrator, and Illustrator creates the graphics by creating these endpoints or these paths, and then it uses mathematical formulas to create the lines to connect the dots, basically. So what happens is with Illustrator, you can resize that shape or that letter A to be as small or as large. So we could resize it to be, um, on the side of a building, and um, it would never lose any of its quality. So it would always just be recalculating to create those crisp lines on that shape. Now, when we look at Photoshop, that's an example of a raster-based program. And here what we see is, it's a little bit hard to see, but this A is created not by creating the outlines, but instead it's created by tiny pixels that comprise what we see as the positive space or the black in this letter A. So then what happens, and you can kind of see it here, when we start to enlarge that, there just simply isn't enough information here. So Photoshop will start to average those pixels and do a little bit of work for us, but what we'll start to see are the edges of those pixels as we start to enlarge that. We'll talk a little bit more about resolution and what this all means when we look at Photoshop, but when you're working with Illustrator, that's one reason why it's a great program for logos, because when you create your logo in Illustrator, you can scale it up to appear on a plane, on the side of an airplane even, and it will never lose any of its resolution. So let's take a look at Illustrator. I have some practice files here. Let's see. I have that A example here. Um, So just a quick tour. We have our toolbar up here. In all of Adobe's software, this toolbar at the top will change contextually based on what you're doing. So here it's recognizing this as an object, not as text, and it's giving me different options for the object. Over on the left here, we have our different tools. A quick note about the tools, you can hover over the tool to get a tooltip to tell you what it is. It'll also give you the shortcut there. So when you're really becoming an expert using these different programs, you memorize the shortcut, and you basically usually have one hand on your mouse and another hand on your keyboard, and you're typing in the shortcuts to move to the different tools. Anytime you see a tool that has a little triangle in the lower right hand corner, that means there's some nested tools there. So you may have to click and hold down in order to see the different tools. Just a quick note, I never mentioned this in the beginning, but I'm just kind of doing a demonstration or presentation. I don't expect you to be following along with me at all when I do this. Moving down, we see our stroke and our fill here. The fill is this larger square that's filled in, and it does just that. It's the fill of the shape. So here, there we go. So here we can see we have a black fill. If I use this toggle button, it's going to swap those, and now we see I have a black stroke. So the stroke is what you see here, is just the outline. And then when we're working with those objects, we get different options for strokes. So you can make it large, change the qualities of it, that type of thing. Moving down, we have some more options, quick options for these strokes and fill. We have different view options. This area down here is called the jump menu, one way that we can zoom in and zoom out and jump to different artboards. Over on the right here, we have different panels or different windows. These are all the panels that are included in this workspace, which is the Essentials workspace. So there are different workspaces depending on what you're doing, and they include a different set of default tools, a different default layout possibly. So that said, you can customize your workspace and you can save your workspace. So if you get it to where you like it, you can save it and always reset back to that. I did want to walk you through just creating a sample file. So here, just to create a sample file, I would say File, and then I'd say New. When I do that, I can give it a name. the biggest distinction here is this profile, and that's where we're going to choose whether or not this is going to be used for print or digitally. So all four of these are for digital. A couple things that happen with that. One, when we choose print versus web, the color mode changes. So when we choose a digital format, it's going to show up as RGB. When we choose a print format, it's going to show up as CMYK. Also, the resolution, or the pixels per inch, is going to change. Here for print, we see 300, which is the standard. For digital, we see 72 pixels per inch, which is the standard. So we'll talk a little bit more about resolution in a minute. I did want to touch on that idea of color space. So the primary distinction is between RGB, red, green, blue, that's used for digital, and CMYK, or cyan, magenta, yellow, black, that's used for print. So those digital colors are usually viewed on a monitor of some sort, and so that's how the monitor creates those colors. The CMYK colors, those are usually viewed on paper, and that's usually how the colors are printed on paper. With CMYK, you can't get as bright as colors as you can with digital. So on a digital, you can get, really like neon, vibrant colors. You can't get that same thing with CMYK. Just a little bit about the printing process and why this, distinction. When you're printing with CMYK, what this looks like, I have a little diagram here. Your page will get fed through the printing press. So this example is like if you're sending your piece off to a commercial printer. If you've never been to one of those commercial printers, this is what it looks like. The sheet gets fed through these different kind of machines or plates, and for each one, this one has cyan, this one has magenta, this one has yellow, this one has black. Each one has their own printing plate, and it has its own kind of like a vat of this color. So the page will come through, it'll get printed with all of the cyan, and then it will come through the magenta will get placed on top, it'll come through the yellow will get placed on top, and then finally black. And this is just a small note. This is called a web press because it has a roll of paper that gets kind of sent through the machine, and this is how newspapers are printed. Most often, if we're talking about your annual report that you're sending away to have printed, or your postcards, it's getting individual sheets are getting fed through, so that's called sheet fed. The color laser jets that we use, in our office as multifunction devices, they have a similar setup. You might have seen that inside. They have a cyan, magenta, yellow, and black toner. And this distinction between RGB and CMYK isn't as important when you're just printing to a multifunction device, because that printer will actually change your images for you so that it all prints. The only thing you could run into trouble is if you had an RGB image next to a CMYK image and they had the same color of KU blue, for example, you might see a line between the two, or you might see a difference between the two and wonder why you're getting this weird kind of halo or outline, and that might be because one's RGB and one's CMYK in your design. Just a little bit more about CMYK. If you're after those neon colors, or if you're after an exact color match, sometimes what will happen with CMYK, so here we're looking at an example where this word logo that appears as green was printed using that CMYK process. And what that looks like, if you were to get a magnifying glass, you would see these different dots that are the cyan, magenta, yellow, and black dots that are making up that color. So to the naked eye, you just see green, but if you zoom in, you see those dots. What can happen, from the beginning to the end of your printing run, you can have some variation between pieces, and then also different pieces can have a variation. So oftentimes you'll go to the press to make sure that you're matching the color so that everything looks like KU blue, for example. If you want to completely verify that that color is an exact match, or if you want to have very vibrant or a neon color, what you might do is pay to have what's called a spot color added. So with a spot color, that's a custom mixed ink that's provided, and it's just printed as one piece of color. So this would be the printing plate. It would just have on the plate, it would have that logo, and it would be printing that solid color. So what that looks like in this example is there would be one more of these here at the end that would just have that spot color in it. So, that's only necessary to think about if you're thinking about sending your piece away to the printer. So just kind of just a wrap up about that color space. We have digital, RGB being one of the most popular ways to define that. And then we have print, where you have CMYK or you have spot colors. So let me jump back to Illustrator and let me say, so here I'm going to say web. With Illustrator, you can have multiple artboards. So in this case, I'm going to act like I'm going to be preparing some icons. And so I want 5 icons. So I'm doing 5 columns and 5 artboards. They're going to be 20 pixels apart. And I'm going to say they're going to be 100 pixels by 100 pixels. So here we do see, just the summary. We're using RGB, 72 pixels per inch. So I'm going to say OK. So here I have those 5 different artboards. The artboard is anything in the white area. Anything in the gray area or the pasteboard won't show up when we export the image, as long as we are containing it to the artboard. So here, with my shapes, I could create those shapes for my icons using the shape tool. I could draw the shapes using the pen tool. There's lines. There's other ways to do more organic things. There's some new tools here. Let's see. And I haven't used this one before, so it's giving me an introduction. So one of the new tools they rolled out with the November update is the Shaper tool. And what it allows you to do is gestures to create those shapes. So I can do some gestures like that, and where they overlap, I can let's see, do different things. Obviously, I'm not an expert here, so I can do different things to draw that way. I can, there are like a pencil tool, that type of thing. So some innate things about Illustrator, as you can see, as we're drawing, it's kind of creating this sequence where the first thing I drew is farthest to the back, the next thing I drew is, in front of that. There is this whole idea of arrangement where I can right click, I can send things to the back. There's shortcuts for that are great to recognize or great to know. There's also this whole idea with layers within Illustrator. So you can use layers to help organize or to sequence those graphics. So somewhere in the background, that type of thing. The most complicated file I've ever worked on was a map of the campus, and it had maybe 40 to 50 different layers, and it was really used to kind of organize that image and to make it so that you could just work on one specific layer at a time without altering any of the other ones. I did want to show you one thing that can make quick work of something like icons, and that is live trace. So you might already be familiar with this. But within Illustrator, what you can do is you can place an image and then have it trace it for you. So here, I'm just going to say File and then Place. And I have an example on my desktop. So let's see here. Sorry about this. Well, let me just look it up. I don't see it. Excuse me for 1 second. Well, let me show you how to look this up, because this might be helpful too. So in Google, Googling an image, I might look for my icon here. So I might say pencil. Here, I like to do, I've been into these flat icons lately, so I say pencil flat icon. So now if I click on this images tab, let me zoom in a little bit. I now can say search tools. And this is kind of nice. So it's only when you're on the image search, you can say search tools. I can say I need a large image. in order for this to work, or whatever medium will work. I can even say the type, usage rights. If you're going to be using it as is, that might be something to note. But then this is the example of one I was using. When I click on it, I'll then just say view image, and then I will just save that image to the desktop. So as you're working with this live trace feature, if that's something interesting to you, you might cool. Okay, so I do have that image. So if this is something interesting to you, you might start to realize certain images work better than other images. That's kind of something you have to learn. So now I'm just going to go to File, Place. I'm going to look in my downloads for that pencil file and place it on my image. So let me just make that a little bit smaller. Okay. So here I have this logo, this little image, but let's say I want to modify this. Maybe I don't want the background, I just want the pencil. Well, as is, this is just an image, so I would have to take it into Photoshop in order to Photoshop out the background. But with Live Trace, what I can do is it will actually trace this for me and recognize those different shapes. So basically what you end up doing, you place your image here. Just to note, that image when it's placed by default is linked. If you want to, you can embed it, but by default it'll always be a linked file. But once I select that image, I get this option here, image trace. So I'll go ahead and select that. It just provides the basic default, which doesn't look good, but here in preset I can change it to something that will be more appropriate for this one. So I chose 16 colors because I knew there was a lot of colors. I didn't know how many, so I just went for 16. So it's going to trace it, it's going to recognize the different shapes, and what it's going to do, it's going to actually create vectors out of all those different areas. So here now it looks great. A couple last steps. I need to expand this in order to get the individual shapes. And then if I want to, let's say, subtract the background out, I might have to go to Object and ungroup this. So it's by default it'll always be treated as a group. So I might have to do that in order to use the black arrow to delete the pieces that I don't want. And then what's nice is you can change the colors because it is a vector. So now I can select, let's say I need this to be a little bit darker. I can do that as well. So if you're interested in this idea of live trace or just learning more about Illustrator, I will cover this at the end, but we do have an Illustrator Basics class. Currently that's all we have, but we can, do things custom as well if that's something you want. So let's switch back and see. Any questions there about Illustrator? Whoops. Cool. Okay, no questions so far, so we'll keep moving. So the next one we have to talk about is Photoshop. So Photoshop, it's a raster-based software best used for resizing, manipulating photos, retouching photos, resizing photos, that type of thing. Here it says projects that will stay a fixed size. So that is because it's raster-based, because those images are comprised of pixels. You can't enlarge that very much. So we'll talk a little bit more about that idea of resolution, but basically you're kind of stuck with the resolution that the image is captured at or created at. It is used for animated or static banner ads, so you can do those animated GIFs. You can do some other things within Photoshop. I don't believe you can do those anywhere else, but I could be wrong. So I have Photoshop open here. Let's see, it's going to look pretty similar to what we looked at, especially that with Illustrator. Let me see. So with Photoshop, again, toolbar at the top. This area will change based on what you're doing. We have our individual tools along the left. Those can be nested, or those are nested. If you see a little triangle in the lower left-hand corner, we see our swatch. Actually, this is foreground and background in this case. We see our different panels. of which layers is very important in Photoshop. It's kind of a non-optional thing. With Illustrator or InDesign, layers are pretty optional to use, depending on what you want to do. With Photoshop, anything you create or anything you do usually creates a new layer. So this is a great example of a Photoshop file that was provided by Ryan Stevie, who works here in our design department. So I can toggle back and forth and I can show you this was the original. There is a water bottle, there's some construction here, and a logo. So what he did is I'll just toggle back and forth. He just took those things out and kind of brightened the photo, made it more color. Another example here, we have this idea. This was a sample I did on the left. I actually made this photo kind of look weird so that I could make it look better. So the photo wasn't actually taken like this. This is this new school of business building. I could use Photoshop to straighten this out. So I purposely tilted it as an example to show how you can make Photoshop straighten that photo. And then I Photoshopped in some clouds in the background that didn't exist there before to try to give it kind of a blue sky kind of look. So all those things you can do in Photoshop. We need to talk a little bit about image resolution. With image resolution, what we're looking at usually is referred to as pixels per inch, and what it is the number of pixels in the image. So sometimes you'll have most of the time now presented as pixels per inch. And really your resolution is a ratio, like it says here, of the height, the width, and the pixels. So if you have a 10 by 10 image that's at 72 pixels per inch, that means it's a total of 720 by 720 pixels. And then, the other example, 10 by 10 at 300 pixels per inch, that'll be 3,000 pixels by 3,000 pixels. So higher resolution photos have more pixels, which really just means more information in that file, and the file size is generally larger. There are some standard image resolutions. 72 pixels per inch, that's the standard for digital. You might have remembered that when we looked at Illustrator and we said this project is digital. It made it RGB and it made it 72 pixels per inch. If you're printing, what you want to strive for is at least 300 pixels per inch. That's around what is perfect. You can sometimes get by with 150 pixels per inch, but 300 is the magic number. And then anytime you're going to zoom in or enlarge something, you're going to look for an image that's over 300 pixels per inch. So I'll show you how to look at this in Photoshop here in a second, but basically when you resize your image or when you're just using your image in your layout, that possibly affects the resolution. So the example here is if you have an image that's that perfect 300 pixels per inch, but then on your layout you enlarge that image to be twice its regular size, you're cutting the resolution in half. So this is a ratio, like I said, so if you're making the image twice the size, then your resolution will be half of what it was. You can technically in Photoshop resample and give the image a new resolution, but it's really false because you can't create resolution when the information really isn't there. So the best option is always to start with a high resolution image. So let me show you that option and where you see that. I'll go back to this A. So here, if I go to image and I go to image size, that's where you can view that resolution. And here what I see, kind of interesting. I messed around with this before, so it says it's 6,000 pixels per inch by 6,000 pixels per inch, and the resolution is 72 pixels per inch. I remember what I did here. I actually forced it to resample. So let me look at a different one here. Let me look at this student example. So again, I'm going to go to File, Image Size. Here, I see it's 8 inches by 5 inches, 150 pixels per inch. So the key thing here is this resample box. When I resize the image, I want this to be unchecked. And as you can see here, this is denoting that this is a ratio. And if I change this resolution, for example, I'm just going to hit the up arrow to make it larger. You'll see that the width and the height become smaller. So let's see, I'm going to change this to 300. Now the width is 4 inches, so half of what it was. The height is half of what it was. However, our dimensions or our pixels should stay about the same. So this is the way that you want to do it. This is actually true. If I were to say resample, here I could say 600, but what we're seeing here, or maybe I'll make it even larger in the preview, is that it's not truly resizing that to have more resolution. We can see that because it's pixelated or rasterized. So not a good idea. And then here I just switched it back, so now if I want something to have that resolution for some reason, the width is only going to be an inch. So cancel here. So lots of different tools with Photoshop. We don't currently have a Photoshop class on the calendar, but we're working on that. With Photoshop, when you're looking at altering your images, the most important thing usually is to make sure that you can undo anything you do. So one way that you'll do that is by copying the original in this case. So here in the layers, I can draw that original layer. I can drag that down to the new layer icon. And when I do that, it just creates a copy there. It might be a little bit hard to see. I'll put it up at the top. So from there, I can use different tools, lots of different tools here. Usually the hardest thing in Photoshop is learning how to select what you want and then which tool to use. So here, you know, if I want this signpost gone, I can use something called the patch tool, and I can grab those elements and then I drag it over to be what I want to appear there, and that's quickly gone. This will sort of work, but not really. There's other ways probably to do this water bottle. But Ryan did a much better job. So different options there. Patch tools, clone tools. I guess this would be a good one for the patch tool. So if I want to remove that logo, I can quickly do that. All right. Questions there about Photoshop? With any of these tools, it's kind of challenging because there's so many different ways to do the same kind of thing. So in Photoshop, to achieve the same result, there's just like so many different ways that you could go about doing it. I usually have to Google just to find out a few methods and choose the one that I like the best. Alright, well then let's move forward to InDesign. So InDesign is a vector-based software best used for documents with multiple pages. So print projects such as brochures, newsletters, books. You can also use it for single-page documents, projects with one or more formats that will change in size. So you can use it for things that will change in size because for the most part it's vector-based. Some other things I could mention here, InDesign you can use sort of like external data to do a sort of data merge. So I've used it before to do like certifications where I brought in an Excel worksheet to bring in individual people's names and that type of thing. So let me open a file here, an InDesign file, and talk to you a little bit about what that looks like. So here in InDesign, same kind of look as the other ones. We have our toolbar at the top. Again, this toolbar will change based on what we're doing. We have our different tools running along the left. You know, the stroke and fill. We have different preview modes here. That's something I like to share with people who are familiar with InDesign. So if you want to toggle back and forth between your print preview versus your design, what is it called? Normal. Your normal view where you see your guides and your margins and everything, then that's something you can do with that W keyboard shortcut. We have our jump menu down here. If we'd want to jump to the 20, page 20, we can do that. One thing you might notice is that in your graphics, you might see that it looks a little bit pixelated or distorted. In this case, what I've done is place these images, and so what it's doing is it's just showing a preview that is will render quickly, but this isn't actually the resolution. A couple things with InDesign. One thing, by default, you will see on your pages there'll always be a small A to start out with in the corners. This is referring to the master page. So what I did is I clicked up here on the master page, And what basically how it works is anything I put on my master page will show up across all of my pages that have that master applied to them, and by default it's always applied. If I don't want the master applied, I could drag none onto that page and it would disappear. So a typical thing to do is put your footers and your page numbers there. Also, you might put your guides there and your margins so that they appear across all of your different pages. Um, we gotta talk about one key thing with InDesign, and that's a little bit about how it works. So here's an example of maybe the front page of a newsletter that was laid out in InDesign. So what the designer would come and do is they would come through and they would place frames for all the different areas. So a frame for the headline, a frame for the images, a frame for the logo and the copy. So all those frames, they'd place that. They'd usually set up a grid for their document, and they'd place those frames based on the grid. Then for the text, they'd either copy and paste that or import it, or I believe you can link to it as well. They'd place that or copy and paste that into the different frames. But for the images, that's what's going to be, they're going to be what's referred to as placed into the frames. And in doing so, those images will always be linked to the document. They'll usually never be a part of the document or embedded in the document. And that's a little bit different than, like working with Word or working with PowerPoint. By default, with Microsoft, those images are always embedded in that file, and they go with the file. In this case, these images are linked to that file, but if we should change the location of the design file or the location of the link, it's going to break the link. And that's usually kind of one of those learning curves new designers have to figure out. So the best option is to do something called packaging, and it's pretty simple in InDesign. You basically just go to File and Package, and what it does is InDesign creates a folder for you, and it creates a copy of your InDesign file. It'll create a PDF for you in the Adobe Creative Cloud versions, and then it creates a copy of all your fonts and puts them in a folder, and a copy of all of your images and puts them in a folder. So then what you have here, this folder you can move anywhere, you can send to anyone. Sometimes you'll have to compress that to make it a little bit smaller, but it can actually be moved without breaking any of the links, because within this folder everything refers to the items within the folder. So usually what will happen for me is I'll get to a good first draft, I'll go to package it, I'll name the folder usually something like _V1, project name _V1. Then when I'm ready to do another round of revisions or design some more spreads, I'll usually open up the InDesign file that's in that packaged folder. I'll make my changes, and then usually what I'll do is I'll just package it again and call that package _V2. So those packages, I mean, they do take up space because each time you're making copies of everything, but usually, at KU, if you're working off or storing things on the server, you shouldn't have too much of a problem with storing those. When we're looking at placing those images, usually within our printed project, we're usually printing or placing an EPS file or a TIFF file. I believe you can also place PDF files. Those PDF files you can actually save in Illustrator to PDF and place that way. If we were working digitally, we would be placing JPEGs, PNGs, or GIF files. So again, this will be on that cheat sheet that I have for you. Different ones have different options. So with these print options, you have the option for a transparent background. That's only possible with a few of the digital options. So that all works that way in InDesign. All right, well, that's been a little bit of an introduction or crash course into what to use when and some of these key design concepts such as raster versus vector, resolution, that type of thing. I just want to cover some next steps. So faculty and staff, if you don't have Adobe on your machine at work, you can ask them for it, and they should be able to push it out to your machine so you can install it. If you want it at home, you can purchase that license for your personal computer at KU Software Web Store. That's kansas.onthehub.com, and I will make sure that's in the follow-up. If you're a student or if you have students, you can download the trial version or you can subscribe at that discounted student rate. And then for help, there's a few different options. Let me tell you about the options that are online that I know of. So one thing I would recommend is the Adobe site has some really nice tutorials. And a lot of times their tutorials have practice files. So this is just the Adobe Photoshop area. And here they have a bunch of different stuff. So essentials for beginners, step-by-step projects, that type of thing. This is just to get started. You know, there's Learn Essentials, key techniques, new features. So a lot of great options there. Of course, there's great options on YouTube. Another thing, if you are a member of the Lawrence Public Library, they have a really nice agreement with lynda.com, which is a video tutorial site. And so there, I believe it's up to 30 users at a time, can log in wherever you're at using this portal through the Lawrence Public Library. You enter your library number and your PIN, and you can watch videos on more advanced topics. We do have some workshops. You can find those workshops at workshops.ku.edu. Currently, we just have Illustrator and InDesign basics. If you'd like to see us cover something else, we could set up a department training for your group. So if you want to go, let's say, more in-depth on that data merge option in InDesign to create maybe some custom student flyers or something, we could do that, set up a department session. We also do desk side coaching. You can fill out this request form and request one of those, and we basically just look for a time that will work for both of us to cover that type of thing. If you're interested in more of these quick learns, we don't have anything necessarily covering Adobe, but you know, you can email us if there's something you'd like us to cover in a quick learn through a webinar, and we can do that. But the last two we have for the spring, in 2 weeks we have task management using Outlook, and then 2 weeks after that we talk about something called My Community. We talk about document libraries in My Community. If you're not familiar with My Community, it's a cool thing to use. We did a webinar a few weeks back, and so when I send out the follow-up, the recording of that webinar is going to be on that same page as today's webinar. So you can view what that is and how you can start taking advantage of it, including your online storage space that's available through My Community using OneDrive for Business. All right, so with that, I'm just going to leave it up to you for any final questions or anything like that. Oh yeah, good question. Will the slides be sent to us? Yes, I will include the slides as well. And thank you, Karen. Awesome. Perfect. Well, I'll stick around for a little while longer if anyone has any questions, but if not, I'll send that follow-up email and feel free to respond to it if you think of anything after this. But thank you all for your time today and for attending, and I'll see you, we'll see you soon. Okay.